As we jump in, we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 4, and we've been walking through this series called Ruins and Renewal since late April or early May. And as we've been walking through it, we've been seeing the Lord is rebuilding his people on different levels, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding their fidelity to the word, and now rebuilding the physical walls around the city in which they dwell. And when we started this, the reality is that this is not for us about building a building. It's not about building a structure. We don't need a wall outside. There's not a project at the end of this that when we get done with Nehemiah chapter 13, be like, all right, and so if you could go get your shovel and your trowel and your sword, we're going to go to work. But there is this sense of, in the world that we live in, far more than not, people are walking through some rubble and ruins that we're asking the Lord to put back together for them. And so as we enter into Nehemiah 4 specifically, what we've seen thus far is kind of Nehemiah's heart, that Nehemiah actually wasn't even originally in Jerusalem with these people. He was back in Persia with Artaxerxes, and he began to hear the story of the condition that his brothers and sisters were in, and he said, Lord, we've got to do something about that. He confesses the sin of not just him, but the generations before him, and asks the Lord for an opportunity, and then just sits and waits for like 4 months. I'm not that patient. I'm like, Lord, I got young man's disease. I need you to do something. I prayed yesterday. How come we ain't seeing stuff happen? Then he gets in front of Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes knows him well enough that when he sees his disposition, he realizes something's wrong, and he takes the opportunity, after thoughtfully being silent and praying, to enter into sharing with him what's going on. And Artaxerxes is like, hey, we'll make it happen. We'll give you what you need. And so he gets sent back with what he needs. And then again, he exhibits this just unique leadership patience where he shows up, and instead of getting to work, he waits 3 days. He rides around and observes the damage and gets to know the condition of the people before he ever opens his mouth to try and lead them anywhere. And then chapter 3 begins to talk about, and Alex set this up last week, that all of these people, after hearing the vision that Nehemiah had, that they enter into the work. He doesn't give them assignments. They just step into what's close to them, and they begin to do the work. And what we've seen all throughout this series is here's what happens. A leader will be called by God to start an initiative of rebuilding and renewal amongst people, and then opposition shows up. Chapter 4, verse 1. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious. He mocked the Jews before his colleagues and the powerful men of Samaria and said, "What are these pathetic Jews doing? Can they restore it by themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they ever finish it? Can they bring these burnt stones back to life from the mounds of rubble?" Then Tobiah the Ammonite, who was beside him, said, "Indeed, even if a fox climbed up what they are building, he would break down their stone wall." And as you hear that opposition, we're going to hear some more as we go through this, but I just want to set the frame. We've said it over and over again. Expect opposition and oppose your expectations. And as we enter in, even in today's text, we're going to see this picture of opposition. And this is actually one of the more simple texts that's going to happen throughout all this series. But as simple as it is to understand, it's going to be difficult to live. And so I just want to invite you in to kind of focus your lenses through the main idea before I pray, hearing the backdrop of the opposition that they're going to face. With every renewal comes a crossroads. The insecurities of our past and the danger of the future can shout at us to stop where we are. Faith must speak even louder. And so we just talked about, they just are hearing this language from Sanballat and Tobiah about, hey, you guys shouldn't be doing this. And every renewal is going to come to a unique crossroads where that opposition is going to come and you're going to have to make a decision. Do we keep going or do we stop? And those voices are going to be immensely loud. And my hope for us today is that the type of courageous response that faith should draw out of us will speak even louder than the circumstances and the opposition near us. Let me pray, and then we'll jump in. And so, Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you for the way that even through a text that is several thousand years before our time, that you can draw truth from it, but not just truth that we might mentally assent, but also encouragement and courage and strength from it. So would you do that today? beyond the capability of my words or my teaching, but would you do that through the depth of who you are and what you're displaying through your word to us? It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen? So as we've seen in the text, Sanballat and Tobiah are not new people to us. They actually show up even earlier back in chapter 1 or chapter 2, and they kind of are murmuring some opposition. But the reality is they actually have no legal standing. At other times during this series, we've seen opposition be able to appeal to the king by sending a letter to the king and getting the king to shut it down. We see that in Ezra chapter 4. Those types of things are happening. But right now, we've just seen Artaxerxes is all in on this project. He is supporting everything that Nehemiah is doing. They have the support of the king. The people know they have the support of the king. And yet there is this language that's coming up out of the mouths of Sanballat and Tobiah that in reality, they actually didn't threaten anything at all. They didn't say they were going to stop them. They didn't say that they were going to somehow remove the strength of what they were building or sabotage it or personally attack them. They didn't say any of those things. Actually, all they said is they just asked some invasive questions. They asked questions like, can you restore it by yourselves? And they asked questions like, will you make a sacrifice or are you ever going to finish this? They ask a really particular question, can you bring burnt stones back to life? Can you revive stones that have been marred? Can you take this rubble and actually create anything out of it? And then Tobiah leans in and says, even if you're able to erect a wall, if a fox runs across it, it's going to fall. Foxes are known for being fleet of foot. They're known for being lightweight animals. And so if you're building a wall and a fox knocks it over, you need to go to Home Depot. You cannot do it. You need their help at that point. And so what they're doing is not actually attacking them or telling them that they're going to stop the work. What they're doing is speaking to their inability and their insecurity. What they're doing is shining this flashlight on, hey, you are a broken people who have struggled. You weren't even doing this work before Nehemiah shows up. And now all of a sudden this guy's going to show up and you guys are going to get your little spots on the wall and you're going to fix it, figure this thing out. How are you going to figure this out? You magicians, you're going to make stones that didn't work before, all of a sudden they're going to come together? And the reality is sometimes the opposition that you face is not that the work that you're doing is going to be stopped because it doesn't have to do with the work. Sometimes the opposition has to do with you. Sometimes the opposition wants to speak to your flaws and failures and your challenges and the mistakes that you've made. It wants to bring up your past and say, how dare you raise your hands in church and think that you're going to be leading somebody when I know what you did last summer? How dare you think that you're going to sit in your community group and act like you can enter into somebody else's life when we know behind the scenes your life is a hot mess? You're going to rebuild somebody else's life when your thing is going to collapse, that if a fox ran across your life, that it would fall apart all over again. How dare you think that you're going to do this? And then they respond with a prayer. Verse 4 says this, listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads and let them be taken as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt or let their sin be erased from your sight because they have angered the builders. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about 4 and 5 more explicitly, but just for the moment, I want you to see what happens that they start talking trash about the builders and it makes the builders a little bit angry. If this was Michael Jordan and it was the last dance, they would have taken that personally. And so it says, so we rebuilt the wall until the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had the will to keep working. So Sanballat, Tobiah, this opposition, they begin to raise their inability, their insecurities, and what it actually does in the people is it actually stirs them to have the will to work and made them mad, and they get halfway through the project. Can I just say to you, here's the scheme of our enemy. While our enemy wants to highlight our insecurities as a flaw, the gospel transforms every inability into a feature of God's power and grace. What's happening is Sanballat and Tobiah are telling the truth about them and talking about their inability and talking about their lack of strength and means and that, of course, you guys can't do this. And in our world, oftentimes, to be honest about our inability and our weakness is something we're trying to hide. It's a flaw. But for gospel-transformed people, being honest about ourselves is a feature. For gospel-transformed people, we do not have to hide our past. We do not have to hide our inability, our struggles, our challenges, because this is the place where God works the most profoundly. I had the opportunity on Tuesday night to speak to a group of men at Lighthouse, and we were talking about gospel courage. And the story that I shared with them is the same story that I shared with you guys back in 2023 about the feeding of the 5,000. And the story of the feeding of the 5,000 has a little boy who has a poor man's lunch, and Jesus says, hey, I can use that. And this little boy has to be willing to give Jesus what belonged to him, but it's not much to work with. The miracle's that much more profound that God uses through this little boy's courage, this little bit of bread and this little bit of pickled relish fish to feed all of these people, that he's using what seems to be insufficient to show off his glory. But that's not just about feeding people physically. That's also feeding people spiritually, that he is not looking for superstars who have it all together, because they do not exist. That he's looking for people who are flawed a little bit and who don't have enough strength and enough ability and enough resources to rebuild their lives the way that they intend to. And yet the Lord looks at that and says, hey, I can work with this. That's not a flaw. It's a feature of the way that the gospel works in our lives. And then the narrative moves from this announcing of insecurity to this breathing of threats. Verse 7 would say this: when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair to the wall of Jerusalem was progressing and that the gaps were being closed, they became furious. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw it into confusion. So we prayed to our God and stationed a guard because of them day and night. In Judah it was said, the strength of the laborer fails, since there's so much rubble. We will never be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they won't realize it until we're among them and can kill them and stop the work. When the Jews who lived nearby arrived, they said to us time and again, everywhere you turn, they attack us. So I stationed people behind the lowest sections of the wall at the vulnerable areas. I stationed them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and fight for your countrymen, your sons and daughters, your wives and homes. Well, now this thing's escalated. Now it's not Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ashdodites just talking about the insufficiencies and the insecurities that exist in the people in Judah. Now they're saying, we got a plan to harm you. We're going to sneak in, and when you don't see it coming, we are going to attack you and kill you, and we are going to make sure, if our first tactic didn't work, this tactic we're going to get it done. And there's this escalation where now it's no longer telling the truth about their past. Now it's this endangering of their future, putting the work and uncertainty. And here's the hard thing. They're halfway through. They're not all the way there. They got just as much work to do as what they've accomplished. And in the middle of this, they're seeing this opposition ratchet up its forces to try and attack them. So much so that the poetry that's coming out of their mouth is that this is too hard. Our strength has failed. We can't do this. The rubble is too much. The pain is too much. This is way too hard. We're not going to get there. And maybe you're not building a wall. Maybe you don't have a DIY project at your house. But maybe the reality is, even as we've been walking through this language of renewal, maybe it kind of started out like, hey, this is awesome. God's with us. He's going to bless us. All the promises of the scripture, that's what Haggai told us, that all of those are available to us. Man, we're seeing in Ezra that God's going to come alongside us and give us what we need, that we can expect opposition, but we can overcome that. We can impose our expectations. We can overcome that. And you got halfway into the work, and you're halfway there, and all of a sudden, the opposition ratcheted up in a way that you didn't expect. And now it's no longer just telling the truth about your past. Now it's putting your future in a level of uncertainty that you're like, I don't know if we can keep doing this. Like if that's what I'm going to have to overcome, the work itself is hard enough, and now you're not just asking me to overcome the hardness of the amount of rubble that's in my life, but there's actually something opposing me and endangering me to do this. One of the beautiful things about the book of Nehemiah is over and over again, and Alex spent a lot of time talking about this last week, about the level of his leadership, both spiritually and practically, but there's something about the way that he can see and discern a situation, and it says he makes an inspection, and then sets up a guard, and it sets up a plan for them to defend themselves. But more than the plan, he's trying to transform their thinking. And so he then says to the nobles, the officials, and all the people, don't be afraid of them. Hold up, bro. They are threatening to kill us. Like, they're no longer just talking smack about our craftsmanship. They are endangering our lives. And so where do you get the boldness to say that? And then here's what he says. Remember the great and awe-inspiring Lord, and then let that drive your ability to fight for your countrymen, for your families, for your home. It's as if he's trying to say, yes, I understand what's in front of you, but I also understand who stands beside you. One of the features of this text, if you were to read it, the scenes change according to this phrase, when they heard. And so the first one is when Tobiah and Sanballat heard, and then it says when the enemies heard, and then when we get down to 15, again, it's going to say when they heard, and that's the way the text is divided. And so it's this moment where it seems like something about what they're hearing is driving their actions, and in the same way, something about what's being professed out of the mouth of Nehemiah is meant to change their hearts. Hey, don't be afraid, because I'm trying to remind you of the great and awe-inspiring God that you serve and that you walk with. Friend, can I remind you of the great and awe-inspiring God that you serve, that you walk with? That you may be halfway through renewal. Maybe you have as much work to do as the work that you've done, and maybe there's enough opposition that you're thinking about quitting at the crossroads where you stand. If everything else feels uncertain and dangerous and not cemented in, here's what I can tell you will not change: the power and the goodness of the God that you serve. So I wrote it this way. When threats make the future feel uncertain, don't lose sight of what is unchanging. The Lord who called you is able to keep you. The Lord wasn't like, oh man, Nehemiah, when you prayed, I didn't know that they were thinking about killing you guys. You should go back to Persia. When the Lord sent them home from exile, he knew that there was going to be opposition. And the same God that called them out of exile, the same God that called Nehemiah to stand in and help lead finishing the work, that very same God that can call can also keep. This is why Jesus would say crazy things in John 10, like anyone that the Lord puts in my hands, I will not lose. The ones that he calls to me, I keep. I pray that we begin to believe that down into the fiber of our being. So here's our main idea again. With every renewal comes a crossroads. The insecurities of our past and the danger of the future can shout at us to stop where we are. Faith must speak even louder. Here's what I want to do with the time that we have left. I want to frame what we've just heard in a way that may feel a little bit more applicable to the world that we live in. And so let me say two things. One is the first one is this. There's this connection between what you see and what you hear. In this text, discouragement came by hearing, but so does faith. There seems to be over and over again this powerful link between what people hear and how it shapes what they see and what they believe. And so think of the story of Elisha and the servant. In fact, this text is really interesting to me because what we're going to read in a second is that it says that the Lord would confuse their plans. And so in this text in Elisha, I believe it's in 2 Kings 8, Elisha and his servant, the thing that's going on is that Samaria is getting super frustrated because every time they have this plan to attack people, Elisha somehow finds out about it as if he's in the room and tells them, hey, do the opposite, and then things go okay. And so they are angry, and so they said, we're going to figure out where he lives. We're going to roll up on him in the morning before he gets his coffee, and we're going to take him out. And so the servant steps outside, and the army is surrounding the house. And so what he sees, I don't know who all else is in the house, but he goes and gets Elisha. So at least the two of them versus an army, I don't like their odds. And he says, my master, alas, look what's happening right now. And Elisha was like, oh, no, bro, we good. They that are with us are more than they that are with them. I'm not good at math, but my master's better than that. And then all of a sudden, what he hears opens his eyes. And he sees the army of the Lord surrounding all those that are surrounding them. And so something that he heard changed the way that he saw what he believed. That could have been a random occurrence. And so let's jump in the New Testament and see if that works. There's a man named Bartimaeus, and Bartimaeus is a blind beggar. And so the deficiency that he has is that he is unable to see what is going on around him. And specifically the way that Mark tells the text is that when Bartimaeus heard of Jesus, he cried out. So he hears something that changes the way that he operates. And when he hears that thing and cries out, all of a sudden his eyes open up. Isn't this the story of the woman at the well who all of a sudden has this conversation with Jesus, runs back in town, starts telling people about Jesus. They run, they meet him, they said, hey, first we heard, but now we see the Messiah for ourselves. Then all of a sudden what they hear opens up what they see. Isn't this what happens over and over again in the book of Revelation? That it's not just what John sees, it's what John hears. And so they will speak something to John, and then he'll see the reality being played out. And so he hears about the root of Jesse and the Lion of Judah, and then all of a sudden he sees this blood-spattered lamb, as if to say that even in the middle of suffering, that the strength and power of Jesus is still being shown as king and ruler for all. What you hear is linked to what you see. And I understand that discouragement came because of what was said by Sanballat and Tobiah. I understand that discouragement came because of the threats that they made. But at the same time, faith comes by hearing. And so as they begin to hear Nehemiah speak to them, hey, don't be afraid. Remember who your God is. Something stirred up in them to believe and to continue to move forward. Be careful who you listen to. I watched a video the other day. This is the only time I'm going to say anything positive about the University of Duke ever in a sermon. I'm a North Carolina guy. There's a story about the legendary head coach Mike Krzyzewski and one of his players, Shane Battier. And Shane Battier was a good player. You don't go to the University of Duke University. You don't go there if you're not good. But he was second-guessing himself, doubting himself. And what would happen is that Coach Krzyzewski would just sit with him all the time and just tell him, hey, here's how I believe in you. Here's what I see in you. And what started happening in Shane Battier is that as he started hearing what Coach Krzyzewski was saying to him, he started mirroring what he was hearing. The voice that was speaking into his life changed what he believed about himself. I just want to ask you to be careful who you let in. All the voices that you're doom scrolling through are probably stirring more discouragement than faith. All the times that you're turning on your newsfeed and the newsfeed is telling you, hey, the world is falling apart. You're in a endangered, fragile minority as an evangelical believer. And so therefore you need to protect yourself because the world is falling apart. Like that's not what you've been called to be. That don't lose sight of your great and awesome God who is at work on your behalf. And here's the second thing. I said it at the start of the text, but I'll say it again. Nehemiah chapter 4 is simple, but it's not easy. The story of this chapter is simple enough to understand, but it's not easy to live. Man, as we've preached through this series, the number of times that I've had to read through lists of names that I'm just making up how they sound out loud. The number of times that I've had to try and wrestle through, hey, this is this ancient festival, and here's what it means. The timeline of these books, like, this is the easiest text that I probably will get to preach throughout the entire series. It is simple to understand. There was opposition, they kept going. There was opposition, they got a little bit frustrated. And you keep reading the text, and then the opposition got confused, and they kept going. Easy. It is easy to understand. It's a little difficult to live. It's a little difficult to live because even the way that they're responding to the opposition feels like it's not applicable to us. Let's read some of the things that we say. I mentioned before, we'll go back to verses 4 and 5. Listen, our God, for we are despised. Make their insults return on their own heads, and let them be taken as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their guilt or let their sin be erased from your sight. When was the last time you prayed like that about somebody? Some of you are like, man, I've been looking for a way to pray for my ex. Like, don't do that. Don't do that. We don't pray that way. The Psalms do that. It's called an imprecatory psalm. It's this sense of, Lord, would you visit back upon them the judgment that they deserve? We got to feel uncomfortable with that. And then if that doesn't make you feel uncomfortable, we've already seen some of it in the text before, but let's just finish out the rest of the chapter. Verse 15 would say this: when our enemies heard that we knew their scheme and that God had frustrated it, every one of us returned to his work on the wall. From that day on, half of the men did the work, while the other half held spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers supported all the people of Judah who were rebuilding the wall. The laborers who carried the loads worked with one hand and held a weapon with the other. Each of the builders had his sword strapped around his waist while he was building, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is enormous and spread out, and we are separated from one another along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work, while half of the men were holding spears from daybreak until the stars came out. At that time, I also said to the people, let everyone and his servants spend the night inside Jerusalem so they can stand guard by night and work by day. And I, my brothers, my servants, and the men of the guard with me never took off our clothes. Each carried his weapon, even when washing. I don't know about you. I'm not really sure how to apply that. If we were in the state of Texas where I'd done ministry before, somebody in the back of the room would have been like, seal and carry, let's go. Somebody in the back of the room putting face paint on like they were Rambo. Like, I don't think that's what this text is about. That reference didn't make any sense to you. Like they were John Wick. And so like the aggressiveness of making sure that they had their weapons at all time, staying on the ready, having weapons in one hand and work instruments in the other hand, that doesn't feel like it's applicable to most of what we live. So here's the question. Where is the line between biblical courage in the face of ridicule and threats and our modern Western idea of power through violence? Because if I said, hey, we're going to be back here at 2 o'clock for Dwell, bring your journal, bring your pen, bring your gun, you'd be like, what kind of prayer meeting is this? And so something about the way that we're seeing weapons, and honestly, the application of Nehemiah as a leader of a nation that's building a defense system for themselves is very different than maybe the personal tension that you might be feeling. But at the same time, how do we appropriate that? I think the New Testament is helpful. The Apostle Paul, in the book of Ephesians, begins to write at the very end of the letter this language about being prepared for war. Verse 10 would say this: finally be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength. Put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil, spiritual forces in the heavens. For this reason, take up the full armor of God so that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and having prepared everything, to take your stand. I'll continue to read, but do you know what context that Paul is writing this in? The verses before it are things like husbands and wives. Here's how you get along. It's the verses that we read at weddings. It's children, obey your parents. It's slaves, obey your masters. And so he's talking in this real world relational context of, hey, you need to be prepared for battle, and you're not battling against flesh and blood. And so here's the reality that we as believers, we're not necessarily grabbing weapons, but what I also want you to hear is the opposition that you may feel against somebody, it's not your boss, it's the devil. And some of you are like, that's a semantic argument. I think they're the same person. If you're on staff here, don't laugh. There seems to be, but what Paul would argue is the warfare that you're entering into and the relationships that are in your world, that's not just people. That there's something behind that wants to separate, that there's something demonic about the disunity of people that happens in our world. And so instead of bringing weapons to the fight that can't do anything to the fight, there's this language that you say, you can't bring a knife to a gunfight. You can't bring a weapon like a physical weapon to a spiritual fight. And so Paul says that if you're going to take a stand, here's what you need to do. And then he lays out this language starting in verse 14. Stand therefore with truth like a belt around your waist, righteousness like armor on your chest, and your feet sandaled with the readiness of the gospel of peace. In every situation, take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the sword of God. And I wish I had time to walk through all of these. And I'm not going to do the preacher thing this morning. I don't think I even have the voice for it. But I do want to highlight a couple of things. The breastplate of righteousness and the belt of truth. Paul wasn't just sitting in jail and looked over at a Roman soldier and was like, oh, you know what? I like your armor. Let me write about that. He's actually quoting Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59 actually starts pretty brutally. Because the prophet is saying to the people, you have been unjust, you have been unfaithful. The reason you're in the situation that you're in is because of the way you've lacked justice and lacked faithfulness. And then he gets to a point where he says, and then the Lord looked and saw no justice and no man to bring it. And so he pulled out his own arm. He put the breastplate of righteousness on himself. He put the belt of truth around his own waist, and he came down and rectified. What Paul is saying to them is, what you need to do is you need to embody what God is in an unjust world. And so how do we live out Nehemiah 4? We embody who God is in an unjust world. And we live out these spiritual disciplines that he's talking about. Those are not cute things that get you merit badges at Awanas. They get you ready for battle. Reading your Bible, being in community, getting on your knees and praying, understanding how to stir up faith by hearing and surrounding yourself with people that are speaking God's word instead of worldly discouragement. Those are not just cute things that Christians are supposed to do on Sundays, but this is how you get ready for war. And so I want to invite you into that. Last week, Alex ended the text talking about that everybody had a specific place. Maybe you didn't know what your specific place was. But wherever it is that the Lord has placed you, he's placed you there to be the Nehemiah that counteracts what people are hearing that's discouraging them by speaking faith to them. That job that you're at, it's not because you have the best font on your resume. That neighborhood that you live in, it's not because that's just the house that you could afford. It's because the Lord strategically has placed you at this place in the wall to help bring renewal and rebuilding. And as you enter into that place, you get to live out being the Nehemiah that helps to lead people out of the discouragement and into the courageous faith that they need. I want to be really specific about that for just a moment. I recognize that we just kicked off the school season, or maybe for some of you, it's getting ready to come. And you didn't get the classroom that you got. You didn't get the teacher that you got. You're not taking the major that you may take. You're not homeschooling in the way that you're homeschooling because it just so happens to be the way things worked out. but that the Lord has assigned a specific place for you to enter into and be faithful. And I just want to pray over you. I want you to hear from me that you can set your eyes on the unchanging Lord who called you and is also able to keep you. And maybe you don't need that today because maybe you're like 2 days into the semester and you still like the kids and the kids still like you. But next week you might need it. You may be early in a season, or maybe you're halfway in and there's as much work to be done as what you've already completed. And you need to be reminded of the faithfulness of the Lord. I'd love to pray over you before we end our time. So Jesus, I know not everybody under the sound of my voice is a student. I know not everybody under the sound of my voice is in education. But I do know that we are in a specific season where that is in our hearts and our minds because so many of us are starting the work. And discouragement will come. We will hear the whispers about our insecurities. Those are not flaws. They are features where your grace and your power can be displayed. I pray that none of us know the level of threat that's in this text, but maybe it's not physical threat, but maybe it's gossip and slander and people conspiring against to try and make our future uncertain. I pray that we would arm ourselves with the armor that you've made available, and that you would wear yourself. I didn't finish the text, but I think it's important that one of the things that the text would say is that we would pray in the Spirit at all times. As if to say, if you want to hold all of this together, that what the thing that holds it together is using the Spirit of God that's been given to you as an evidence of new creation because you belong to Him. Pray in that Spirit at all times as you navigate this challenging world that's in front of you. So would you help students and teachers and parents navigate that in this season? Well, regardless of what school looks like, whether it's at the kitchen table or whether that's at a local building, whatever it may be, would you help us to enter in knowing that we are these Nehemiahs that are speaking encouragement over the discouragement that the world may speak? That's not just true for those that are in education. That's true for people that are going to Northrop Grumman. That's going to be true for people that are working at Starbucks. That's going to be true for people who are stay-at-home adults that are taking care of their family, or maybe they're freelancers that work their own business. Whatever it may be, that there's this opportunity for us to enter into this world that is full of all of these voices that want to raise our insecurities and raise these threats of what the future may be, and say to them, don't lose sight of our awe-inspiring great God. And that we might embody the nature of who you are, Lord, in a crazy, mixed-up world. I ask you for that grace today. It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen.
Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.